In today's edition of Issues and Insiders, we revisit the status of women's rights here in Korea and in places of brutal armed conflict as we mark International Women's Day on this Friday. Hello and welcome to Friday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today, that is March 8th, we celebrate International Women's Day, and in light of this occasion, we delve into the rights of women as protected by law, especially in regions of rampant armed conflict such as Ukraine. For more on this, I have Professor Cho Hee-kyung at Hongik University live on the line. Professor Cho, it's been a while. Welcome back.
It's a pleasure.
I also have Doctor Sabine Freizer, the representative UN Women, that is, over in Ukraine. Dr. Freizer, it's a pleasure.
Good morning, Sunny.
Right, Professor Cho, let's begin off then with a few words on the protection of women's rights by law here in South Korea.
Well, women's rights are expressly protected under our constitution. Gender equality is enshrined under Article 11 of our constitution, and there is an express prohibition against discrimination based on gender. Also, women's labor is given special protection. It expressly provides that women should not be discriminated based on their gender, regard to employment, wages, and conditions of work. There are other pieces of legislation, including the Basic Act for Gender Equality and also an act that prohibits discrimination between men and women and which provides specific remedies for it. But the reality is that we still consistently rank at the bottom of the table in OECD countries when it comes to gender equality in our society. Women are still paid some 30 to 40% less than men for exactly the same work. There are an equal number of female and male students at university, and they typically start off in the same place when they are at the beginning of their career. But as years go by, women end up falling behind, and there is very little representation of women at the upper echelons in management, in the highest public offices in our country. Even right now, we've got the general election coming up, and less than 10% of candidates will be women. And so what is causing this vast difference? The basic reason is that the brunt of childbearing, child rearing, and unpaid housework typically still fall on women. And it's women who usually end up having to give up their careers to look after the young and sometimes the elderly. Women are still 80 to 90% of victims of sexual violence and domestic violence. And so although we have made a lot of progress in terms of legislative changes, in reality, we still have a long way to go. And it doesn't help that the current administration is essentially claiming that we've achieved gender equality in our society, and therefore we can abolish the Gender Equality Ministry.
Right. Professor Cho just mentioned violence, Dr. Freizer, and speaking of that, of course, what can you share with us about the status of women's rights in places of conflict where there is much violence, of course, like Ukraine?
Thank you very much for having me on this morning to celebrate with you International Women's Day. I'm joining you from Kiev in Ukraine, where women will be out celebrating today's very special day. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that this war that's been going on for 10 years, but that has been particularly violent since the start of the large-scale aggression by the Russian Federation in February 2022, has had a disproportionate effect on women and girls. So what we mean by that is that, of course, women have been victims of this invasion. We have seen at least 3,000 women who have been killed, at least 200 girls who have been killed, and those are estimated to be vastly underestimations of the actual numbers. And we see that in every other area, women are the majority. So women are the majority of those who are currently refugees outside the country. They are the majority of the displaced persons. There are still approximately 4 million internally displaced persons in Ukraine, and still approximately 6.3 million Ukrainians who are living as refugees outside the country. So the majority of these are women and girls. And here at the UN, we also estimate those who are still in need of humanitarian assistance. And out of the 14.6 million Ukrainians that are still in need of humanitarian assistance, again, the majority are women and girls. So what we're seeing is that this war is having a terrible toll on women and girls, is affecting their access to housing, to education, to jobs, and of course, to basic security for their livelihoods. Yes, this war is having a very, very difficult and terrible effect on the access to rights for women and girls in Ukraine.
Right, and more specifically speaking, Dr. Freizer, you've said before in a previous interview, I believe, that Ukraine's attention on gender equality issues have helped the country to better address conflict-related sexual violence against women there in Ukraine amid Russian invasion. First, what exactly is meant by conflict-related sexual violence, Dr. Freizer? And second, how is this appalling atrocity against women there being addressed in Ukraine?
The issue of conflict-related sexual violence has been one that has been plaguing Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Conflict-related sexual violence is, in short, the use of sexual violence as a tool of warfare. So it can be terrible sexual violence that you see in detention. It can be soldiers coming into people's homes and using sexual violence. There are many different forms of this. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, this has been a form of violence used by Russian forces. And we have very approximate more than 300 cases that have been reported so far. But it is estimated that the cases are much higher, and particularly in zones of Ukraine that are still occupied by Russian forces. Unfortunately, we don't have access to those survivors and are not able to calculate the numbers there. Ukraine, as the government of Ukraine, has taken this on very seriously and is putting in place various measures to try to address this problem.
Right, and before we delve into those measures, Professor Cho, what are the legal consequences of sexual violence in times of war under international law?
The international law now recognizes rape and sexual violence in times of war as being able to constitute war crime or crime against humanity and or a constitutive act with regard to genocide. And there is actually a UN resolution passed in 2008 to this effect. But, you know, rape has been used as a weapon of war against women since time immemorial, but it's only been in recent decades that we've actually started to prosecute these crimes as part of war crime and crimes against humanity. In fact, the special tribunals established to deal with the crimes committed during the former Yugoslavian conflict and Rwanda, these were the first international tribunals that actually had or included rape and sexual violence within their jurisdiction to try those crimes. But in reality, it's very difficult to gather evidence in places of conflict, and victims are either dead or very reluctant to come forward, and also difficult to mount individual prosecution against the perpetrators. So there's some progress being made to make people accountable who have perpetrated these kind of crimes, but it's an uphill struggle.
Right, and that being said, Professor Cho, to what extent can the international community serve to better protect the rights of women in regions of rampant conflict, do you think?
Well, when conflict is actually raging and you have soldiers barging into your home with guns, it's very difficult to protect yourself under those kind of situations. But what could be done in order to try to hold these people accountable is to actually try to preserve as much evidence as you can, and also to train people who can go in afterwards to gather evidence. And in fact, we have seen some examples of such education and training of gathering evidence, and also training and educating courts in terms of being accepting types of evidence that can be used to prove these kind of crimes. And so the conflict in Congo, the government in Kinshasa actually took the advice of international community and NGOs and put those practices into action. And there we actually saw some increase in terms of successful prosecutions against perpetrators. So these are some of the things that could be possibly done.
Right. And for more on the possible efforts that can be taken by women's rights advocates around the world, Dr. Freizer, what more can you tell us about their efforts to ease the plight of their counterparts in countries like Ukraine?
Just on the issue on conflict-related sexual violence, also just to underline that there's a prevention aspect. So it's also important to make it clearly understood that this is an international war crime. So to already start training armies, police, etc., before a conflict or before they move into operations, to make them aware that they will be held accountable afterwards if they do commit these crimes. I mean, what we clearly see in the case of Ukraine is that the government is focusing on gender equality as a way, actually, of resistance, as a way to ensure that the country is strong. And international women's organizations have been playing a very important role in solidarity of their counterparts in Ukraine. In Ukraine, we have a very strong feminist movement. We have very well-organized women's organizations that are doing all kinds of support, everything from humanitarian assistance, providing shelter to displaced persons, but also the legal support, providing legal aid, providing also support in terms of economic empowerment. So it is really a useful partnership between government, civil society, the United Nations, and other international organizations and partners to support the rights of women in Ukraine today.
Right, and delving into detail, Dr. Freizer, as the representative of the UN Women in Ukraine, what can you tell us about your activities to, of course, ease the pain of the women there?
The UN Women in Ukraine has been present here since 2016, and we focus on a few areas of work. One of them is humanitarian assistance, and one thing that we have here, as we do in some other countries, is we have what we call women safe spaces. So these are usually together with women's rights organizations. We set up places, houses or apartments, where women who have been displaced, who have been affected by the war, can come, can get psychosocial support, economic support, and so on. We also work very much on something called women, peace, and security. Ukraine, like Korea, have been following the 1325 National Action Plans, which is a UN Security Council resolution which aims to ensure women's protection during war, but also to ensure women's leadership. For example, women in police, women in defense sector. Finally, we also work very much on women in government, women's leadership, and also women in economic empowerment. So also supporting women who are now the backbone of the economy, to have them access jobs, to have them access finance so they can start their own businesses. This is really a big area of work that we see growing in the coming years.
Right, of course, women empowerment then. Meanwhile, Professor Cho, back here in this part of the world, Seoul and Tokyo remain divided on the issue of closure for comfort women, South Korean comfort women, that is, who were forced to sexually serve Japanese soldiers during World War II. Now, some pundits claim, Professor Cho, that this particular issue needs to go beyond the table of diplomats and onto the table of women's rights advocates. What do you say?
I think the issue should have been approached from the beginning as a human rights and women's rights issue rather than a political football that it now is. Unfortunately, both countries are actually guilty of treating this as a political issue and not really working hard enough to resolve it. With Japan, Japan has for a long time regarded itself as a victim, in effect, of World War II, ultimately, rather than the aggressor. And the legacy of Japanese wartime leadership actually still continues in the Japanese political system to this day. And Japan considers that this issue has been dealt with and closed thanks to the agreement that was struck under the Park Chung-hee administration back in the 60s. And they still refuse to be held accountable and still even refuse to even issue an apology for it. But the Korean government is equally guilty of not having been consistent enough about the issue. It actually ignored the issue altogether for a very long time. And even after it began to deal with the issue, depending on which administration is in power, it continues to be hot and cold about how it approaches this issue, rather than trying to actually find a resolution consistently for the surviving victims. And so as voices are growing now, the issue should really be approached as a human rights issue, and that would allow us to form a solidarity with victims from other countries who are also victims of Japanese wartime sexual slavery acts, and be able to find some sort of resolution for the surviving victims. And time is short because most of these victims are very elderly now. We only have a handful of them left. And also at the same time, what the Korean government could do is to look at its own past and address issues that it has created, for example, in its participation during the Vietnam War, and set an example that way. So yes, I wholeheartedly agree that the issue should be really approached as a human rights and women's rights issue than remaining a political football.
Right, a very valid point right there, Professor Cho, if I may say so myself. Moving forward, Dr. Freizer, what do you propose to promote the rights of women in regions that recently endured violence? Many believe that in times of restoring a country after war, women's rights issues are often put in the back seat. What are your thoughts?
Let me take this opportunity just to also wish you and everybody who's watching us today an excellent International Women's Day. Even amidst the war here in Ukraine, we are celebrating this holiday. And it is important to note that this year, it is particularly focused on financing for gender equality. This, I think, is appropriate during wartime, after war, in countries that are not affected by war, is to ensure that there is appropriate financing to promote gender equality. That kind of financing can mean financing to support women's rights organizations, women's activists, but can also mean budgets. It is important that countries use tools such as gender-responsive budgeting to ensure that they're putting enough money into their national budget to address issues that the professor mentioned earlier, for example, the care economy. Even here in Ukraine, issues of care are on the agenda because it will be important to ensure that we have sufficient kindergartens, sufficient schools, so that women can really go out into the workforce. So investing in women is important in all cases. And also the issue of women's leadership is very key. So to ensure that women can actually be taking decisions on how conflicts are run, how they're resolved, and how peace building occurs, it is important to have the gender balance. So to have an equal number of women in government, an equal number of women in elected office in parliaments. And so this is something that here in Ukraine, when there will be the next round of elections, hopefully they will be using quotas so that they will really force the political parties to have at least 40% of all women on the ballot, all candidates on the ballot to be women. Because what we really hope is that in the peacetime, women will continue to lead in government, in the economy, and of course in their communities.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, we have a minute left. Professor Cho, I extend this question to you very briefly. Here in Korea, what are some of the issues related to human rights that we should be keeping an eye on this year?
Well, there is a plethora, but I would like to mention two in particular. First is we have a growing elderly female population living in poverty. Women live longer than men, and it's usually widows who have lost their husbands, who no longer have an income of their own, and they end up homeless and living on streets. And because they are vulnerable to attack, they typically hide themselves. And so even the public service have a hard time actually locating them to try to provide welfare. And that's an issue we need to keep an eye on. And our current administration is advocating for essentially importing migrant workers to do this kind of, care work that's going to be more and more needed in our society, for especially for the elderly, and even providing domestic help. Now, we know from experience in other countries that this is a very vulnerable population, particularly if they become like live-in housekeepers or nannies. And so this is another issue that is not going to be very visible, and that's something that we really should keep an eye out for.
Right, and perhaps create more opportunities for further discussion on that particular issue then. Professor Cho, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Dr. Freizer, thank you very much for your insights today. Right, well, on that note, we end this week's editions of Issues and Insiders with a prayer to all victims of armed conflicts across the globe for an end to their pain and suffering. Thank you for watching.